My name is Rashi Saxena. I'm a public interest technologist based out of Bangalore, and I'm very excited for our discussion around navigating and ensuring that we have inclusive and accessible digital financial services. We're looking at aiming to ensure a more holistic way of what we understand by inclusivity. And I have two very powerful CEOs who have a range of experience. So we are very excited to be here. We have Liz Steininger, based out of Berlin, Germany, and we also have Ritu David, the founder of Datadog. So I think I'd like to go on and get an introductory remarks from both of them on how we understand accessibility, usability, security, and what does inclusion in the realm of financial services mean to you?
If you want to start with the definitions a little bit, I can just quickly say that with security, there's three aspects that we generally need to be thinking about. It's integrity, confidentiality, and availability. So these are three aspects that we have to talk about whenever we're discussing the topic of security.
Amazing. Ritu?
For me, flipping it to say people first finance, and I think the minute you put people first as a priority, the rest just sort of flows in place, and that may be a bit simplified, but I think it's great as like a problem statement, like this is the biggest stakeholder we have, you know, and that's who we're solving for.
Yeah, I think my definition of accessibility expanded. Earlier, I used to think about it from a point of view of how can it be more accessible to a particular community who has different challenges. But then I completely ignore. So I think I would classify accessibility as 5 core pillars. I look at knowledge because we realize that a lot of people don't necessarily have the digital literacy and know-how of how to be able to navigate the different applications, APIs, websites, and so many other aspects. I also look at digital interactions. We've seen a lot of persons with disabilities require more sophisticated assistive technologies to be compatible, and how do those interactions happen? How do we make it seamless? Whether the two devices are compatible and can interact with each other. Also looking at socio-economic barriers. Not all applications are open source, and sometimes proprietary software and tools can be very expensive. And of course, looking at geographical and cultural barriers to understand the different languages that we have. I mean, I'm sitting in a continent which has a very rich oral tradition. I also come in India where oral traditions have been very high. So maybe in many aspects of explainability, things can be lost in translation, localization needs, so there are so many. I'd also like to open it up to the audience in terms of what are the examples, challenges that they've seen in terms of how to design for underrepresented communities. We'd love to hear from the locals here. Anyone can raise their hands and talk to them.
Hi, my name is Kei, and I'm one of the co-founders of Kumquat, which is a local design consultancy. We work with a bunch of different fintechs and startups from all over the continent. I think for us, when it comes to designing for accessibility, it always starts with a human problem and understanding the human context. So I think when we're designing in a Western space, it's really easy to do digital surveys, interviews, but on the continent, especially because everything is still so in person and trust is based in person, it really starts from going there face to face and interacting with people, and sometimes it's not even appropriate for you or me to be the person interacting with them because it has to come from someone that they can really trust and feel like they can be vulnerable to. So I think some of the common insights that we also saw just designing across the continent was that visuals come first. So I think a lot of us are very comfortable in a text-heavy environment, whereas the visual language and iconography is really so crucial in environments where people don't have financial literacy, they have a very low level or non-existent level of digital literacy, but still need to, make remittances, they still need to get paid, they still need to be able to withdraw money. And then something else that we've also seen is that for symbols and iconography, That's also very different from context to context. So being able to localize and then finally also center around and really catalyze these solutions around a community, because it is so trust-based and it is so relational that you'll often find that it's local communities that can really champion each other and also share knowledge. Otherwise, you just end up designing a tool that kind of just, you know, sits somewhere and it looks nice on a presentation for the stakeholders and the investors and the donors, and it never actually really impacts the people that we want them to.
These points, it reminded me of one of the stories that we wanted to share about how we actually met and started working together in the past. My company was working on some software development for a grant on a secure storage product. And although storage is a bit different than a financial system, some of the same issues around security and accessibility and usability, accessibility, like all of these things still apply. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think there are a lot of socio-cultural barriers around, and of course, as she said, there's a lot of things that are designed for presentations. There are a lot of aspects designed to get an XYZ amount of funding, but what do you think are the core issues that, or the barriers that you've seen in your line of work that kind of hinders people from adopting a particular financial service? Maybe Ritu, you want to go first?
Sure. I run a company, so what we do is not just me. I'm using the word I and we, but that's interchangeable with my team. So I'm not a superwoman when I talk about this, but I was very lucky to be at the right place at the right time. I was doing a study for a bank on inclusive finance in Kenya, where I grew up, and M-Pesa just exploded, you know? And like, I was studying actuarial science at the time, and I was like, how did this happen, you know, outside of the broader banking ecosystem? And the one thing I took from that experience of M-Pesa, and then I think about like 15 years ago, later, so a few years ago, applied it to a very inclusive platform. What M-Pesa did in my brain was say, let's stop fitting banks into mobile phones and let's make the mobile phones the bank, right? And when you flip the approach, you start to look more openly at things. So one of the things that we've been working on a lot is providing voice interfaces and using sound waves. So in India, we've done this in rural India, and we have been working with Access Bank, which is Nigeria's, I think the continent's largest bank, to pilot this in places. And I really do want to try it in South Africa as well, because Cape Town's beautiful. So, but one of the things that we've done is realize that most people have voice as a way that they're very used to speaking and doing things, right? So if a voice interface will facilitate, like in Kenya, Mama Boga, which is like the person that sells vegetables, to just say that, please request payment from XYZ, right? Without her having to go find her device all the time and start texting and taking away from the market environment and her cultural sort of relevancy in that space. And what we've also managed to do is look at, and when I was looking at the ILP, the Interledger Protocol, I realized that what it's done is sort of like create a train system across for finance in a way. And then for me, this sound waves is kind of like that last mile. We're not solving the big stuff, but the last mile with sound waves is that I can close a transaction. Settlement can happen later, but I don't actually need a smartphone. I have a dumb phone with sound waves, and I can also ensure that whatever I need done is done through voice. Then when I get to a local vendor, which is pretty much how a lot of settlement is done in the world, then you go to the local vendor and then it gets settled. Now, the gap between, sorry I'm taking a bit of time on this, but the gap between receiving a text message to say, oh, you've got, 100 rupees in your bank account, to actually getting that money in your hand or in your bank account creates anxiety, right? And so we're all for, like, how do we use local SPOCs in communities to bring that transaction level closure as fast as possible. And I think once people experience it a couple of times, the level of anxiety drops. Like, I remember when M-Pesa was launched, my dad changed from Kencell, which was another mobile provider, to Safaricom, because he was just like, I can't believe that this is insane, right? So for me, it's also about that last mile inclusivity. When people have like non-smartphones, which is most of the world, and people, you know, we think of literacy as a very English and text-based thing, and you were saying that, like, for me, literacy is also about voice, right? And a lot of languages aren't written languages, and the number of times we've recreated banking interfaces for a left to right to a right to left language, I mean, that's a lot of money, and it's very expensive. So I love the voice interface. I think it gives us so much freedom.
Definitely. It also caters to a certain section for persons with disabilities. And a lot of us like to put persons with disabilities in a very umbrella term, but persons with disabilities is a wide range of people. You can classify them as someone who has motor disabilities, someone who has cognitive disabilities. So yes, it definitely helps someone who has grown up in an oral tradition, and also helps a lot of people who might not have English as a native language. So let's be honest. I mean, I come from India, and I think one of the good things I enjoy about the financial services system is that it is trying to at least be inclusive with languages. Smithy might disagree with me, but then we can have that discussion for later. We can move on to Liz, and learn a little bit about what do you think the challenges are.
You know, I mentioned security, and I think it's easy to think that this is not part of accessibility, but it is. That if we want people to feel safe and comfortable interacting with the financial systems, they need to also be aware of the aspects of the security to some degree. So we need to create interfaces. It's challenging. I mean, whether we do voice or visual and how we do it, there's all these challenges around how it functions. But it's also important for how people interact with it from the kind of security mindset too. So how aware are they about what matters and what doesn't matter? And this really ties into the social engineering attacks that happen. We've heard a lot about, like, you know, fraud detection and things like that, and that's important. But like phishing attacks are a great example of social engineering, that it's, you know, the system might be functioning perfectly fine, but if the user doesn't understand, I need to look for these kind of clues that this is not really my bank that's asking for me to log in. That's one challenge that we have to face, is how do we find that ground? And this is where I think the usability testing, the accessibility testing, these touch points that we have with different users, when we're out there, we can also work with them about this kind of exchange of, these are the different the different security models that you're going to be interacting with, and get this kind of feedback loop of that on all these fronts. It's usability, the accessibility, and the security, the privacy. See, how is the user thinking when they're interacting with these financial services, and how can we make sure that we meet in the middle?
Absolutely. I also wanted to see that there are a lot of privacy concerns with a lot of the work that we do, which is sensitive, especially for underrepresented groups and groups that are whistleblowers, for example, or journalists who want to upload important documents, and ensuring how seamless they are. I also come from working and having experience of working in restrictive environments, so you know, applications working in lower bandwidths, quality of services, and ensuring that your data isn't leaked. But yeah, there was an interesting statistics around how WEF said that cybercrimes by 2025 could go to losses up to 10.5 billion. And yeah, in India, there have been concerted efforts on opening cybercrime cells, banks openly giving you PSAs at different times of the day on what not to do. But yeah, maybe Ritu, I'd go to you and learn a little bit about some of the work that you've done on tackling domestic violence in India. And maybe you could also perhaps walk us through what are the privacy considerations that we should take.
Yeah, so I've been really lucky to work on creating the largest data bank of domestic violence in the world. And one of the concerns, like once we got all the data, it was like, all right, let's understand from the survivors of domestic violence, what are their actual needs, right? And one of the biggest needs that came up was, and I'm sort of quoting, I can't leave because if I leave, how will I live, right? So even if they have their own, people are like, oh, why don't you have your own bank account? Now that comes with a whole lot of KYC issues. Like I'm fairly privileged. I moved to India, and to open a bank account, I needed to give them either my father's address, very specifically, or my husband's address. And given that neither had addresses, you know, I was in India, I was sort of just a little bit, you know, surprised that I walk around with my privilege expecting frictionless experiences, and imagine what it would be like if someone's trying to escape that very situation. So even in the case where they may have their own financial account, like a bank account or whatever it is, alternate to banks, it's very easy for the perpetrator to actually find the lady. In this case, and I use lady because of the statistics, but yes, there are men that are, and intergender people that are also affected, but how does she actually leave when she has no money? And even when she has money, it's very easy for someone to go to the police and say, hey, my wife's missing, or my sister's missing, or my daughter's missing. Help me find her. So it's about having, like, there's a tension between security, cybersecurity, and also the physical security of people. And I think for me, inclusive finance is including the people that have been forgotten by networks, but also giving people the right to be forgotten by these very networks, and still facilitating a livelihood for them. A lot of times women do leave with children, and it is a challenging situation. So the financial system's capability of forgetting people but yet banking them is very important, and I'm keen to hear about it. I think there's a session on refugees and how to later today. Yes, okay, great, thank you for that. So yeah, I'm really keen to hear from that, and I think there's a lot of notes we can exchange on how to solve for these so-called edge cases, but it's really not. When you hear the numbers and the volumes, it's really not an edge case.
Yeah, I actually think that it's not an edge case is a really great point. That often I think people think about the accessibility testing or issues and they think, oh, well, this is just maybe a minority. But if we can address those issues, the problems that they face, it can benefit everybody else that's also using these financial services too. I think during some discussions we talked about, you know, something as simple as high contrast can help people who have visual disabilities, but it can also help you if you're in a sunny situation where you can barely read your phone. And I mean, I think that, having it be a separate thing is it needs to be more integrated and more embraced by everybody working on these systems. It's like that you think about accessibility by design, that you think about, like, how am I including everybody, because I'm not looking at the rare cases, these edge cases. I'm really just looking at a range of cases.
And we're also in an environment with people with varied experiences and literacy levels. So how would you explain what a security analysis, or if I might say assessment, looks like? How does that look like? And there's also a lot of debates and discussions around whether accessibility frameworks and usability frameworks hinder or compromise security. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really easy for people to make talking points where you put two things on opposite sides and then say it's one or the other, and there's a dichotomy here, there's a choice. But I don't think that things like security and accessibility have to be on opposite sides from each other. That I find it helpful to think about that first, that there are different layers that we're working on. We're working on everything from infrastructure to all the way to the kind of human component, all the way to like customer support or society, how society is creating legal regulations and things to support all of this. So it's really all these different layers. There's application layer that we talk about too, but to the point of security, it really helps to approach it from as early as possible, just like accessibility. That, you know, from the very beginning, you're really looking at it. But there are things that you can do towards the end, like security assessments, like accessibility assessments, where you're basically doing an audit of the software to see where the holes are, where the vulnerabilities could be, the potential exploits, et cetera. And that helps. And those come out in reports. I think it's really great for those to be shared publicly also, especially if there's open source code.
And also to be written better so that it's understood by a wider audience, because sometimes most of the security reports are something that fly over my head, at least, even as someone who works in accessibility. But then foregrounding accessibility as a core principle and as a prerequisite, it saves a lot of time, and keeping it early on in the planning stage of the development cycle is also necessary. And then, yeah, I think you made an interesting point about open source, and I have two women from the private sector. Ritu, to get your comment on, do you think financial inclusion services should be open source, closed source? What are your thoughts? What are your experiences on that?
I don't actually have an opinion on whether it should be closed source or open source, because proprietary software just does have a role to play in learning and development and in R&D. And I think a lot of the technology that we have created for banks or we've created for institutions hasn't been based on open source, but they have put in the money. And so I think I'll move back 2 steps and say who's funding what, right? And no matter if it's open source or closed source, someone's paying the bill for it and expects an ROI in some sort of way, shape, or form. And so I'll leave it to the people to navigate, you know, what works for them. I also am very nervous about us like doing like Batman and the Joker, where closed source is, you know, like the baddie in the room. So yeah, I think what works for the world, what works for ROI, what works for inclusion, and how that happens is actually none of my business.
I think it really just depends on how we all want the power dynamics and the incentive systems to function. And if it's like other things, information is power, and that you can empower different people by having open source versus closed source. And it has to be a decision. And I think who's investing matters, but also it's like, what outcome do we want as a group? And so if there aren't people funding certain things, then you should be. If you want it to be maybe open source, you need to fund it a certain way versus closed source. In the business models, there's a lot of considerations in there. But yeah, I just always want to remind people that information is power. And this is true for code too.
Amazing. And with all the recent global outages that you've had with what happened in Crowdstrike, and how it also it did hit the financial sector the most, and I think there are cybersecurity insurances that probably covered maybe 10 to 20% of the aspects. And how does one go through that as a measure? Do you look at how do we, and of course, a lot of the financial services transcend a lot of borders. How do we define it as a critical infrastructure? Is there a governance aspect that you see that should be devised depending on whether it's private sector taking care of it? Like in the case of M-Pesa, it's powered by Safaricom, and then we have Airtel back in India and some parts of Africa. how would you define it as a critical infrastructure? Would you or would you not? How would you go about that?
For financial services as critical infrastructure, I mean, I think it is. As you were mentioning earlier, that money can empower somebody to be safe, to have a whole livelihood. And then also we see that financial services are pretty fundamental to businesses operating. So, yeah.
Yes, it's critical infrastructure because without it, human rights without financial inclusion just doesn't make sense, right? Like, I mean, how much does a day in our lives cost us? And imagine if we didn't have that. You're taking away almost all my rights when you take away my access to finance and money. And it's not just about transactions. It's about freedom. It's about empowerment. And I think most of all, it's the most democratic thing, right? Giving people the ability to choose where they, like, how they spend their money. Like, it's so integral to democracy.
Amazing. Maybe we'd open up a few questions and then go back to our panel. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or anything they want to add?
So I'll take a bite at the open source versus closed source and which one is better, because you can't come to an open source foundation forum and then not take a position, right? But for me, it's like, I think what you said about where the ROI is going to be and who's funding it and what they actually want out of that is actually a very important observation. Because if you have a commercial solution that you're putting into a system, then you are aiming for the aggregate. You're aiming for where you're going to be able to get the most return out of that solution, and effectively you are talking about a financial return. So you're going to focus on that part of the population that you are serving that actually has money to give back to you. And that by definition feels like it might be a little bit exclusionary, because now you have your solution that focuses on the aggregate and the low-hanging fruit and everything. But I think if you want a slightly more altruistic perspective on where the financial inclusion is going to come from, then that is unfortunately going to have to come from somewhere else where the ROI values are different. We don't want commercial returns, we want general upliftment in the economy. And in a corporate environment, typically the way that you mention the finance cycle or measure it is so short. It's like an annual cycle. I have an annual return, I want to be able to get the most bang for my buck in the shortest time frame possible. If we are talking about financial inclusion, then you are talking about timescales that are almost glacial by comparison. You want to uplift entire economies and groups of people, and people like the Gates Foundation or Rockefeller have been doing this for decades now to try and uplift people, and they've had great success. But I think for that purpose, more than anything else, I would almost want to champion open source more for financial inclusion, because they care about different metrics in how you are measuring that kind of process. That's just a comment, not so much a question, but if you want to comment on that, please.
Yeah. May I just quickly respond? So my husband works in pharmaceuticals, and for some reason the word is escaping me, and that's his daily bread, so that's very scary. The one where you don't have IP attached to it, what is it called? Ah, yes, thank you. So he sells generic medicine, all right? And my father used to work in a space where it wasn't generics, right? And I know that it's not entirely the same, but at some point, for research and development and for innovation to happen, someone needs to get a return, you know? And so I feel like these two things do need to exist, and like when we're talking about altruism and all of that, at the end of the day, someone somewhere is a for-profit entity like Microsoft and putting in the money into a foundation. So I'm very keen to understand and open it up to the room as to how do we view impact where when we're not facilitating profit, because one really comes from being funded by the other. I don't know how people feel about this. Yeah.
I think I think it's good to look at other industries and and to consider what do we really want in the end. Like you said, if we're trying to maybe be more inclusive, then maybe there isn't the profit angle. So for certain services, so we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the service? Is it more of like the groundwork infrastructure versus like protocols versus apps, and are they focused on particular markets or users? And then the security considerations come into, I think. Do we want that level or that application, that service, to be accountable in different ways? So the accountability that we can have on closed source is just different than the accountability that we can have with open source. It's not to say that closed source allows for no accountability. We can have other avenues, regulations, reporting, and things like that maybe has to be done about how things are working. We see that already with privacy regulations with GDPR. It has certain, data protection and stuff. So I think it's just good to think about, what do we want? But I also don't think it's realistic to say that every piece of software is open source, maybe, because maybe there are certain cases where the closed source is better. I think it's hard to say that anything should be 100% in this world, even though I'm a huge open source fan.
We actually go back to someone else who has a question or a comment.
Yeah, I have a question. So you can't talk about finance without talking about regulation. And so I'm curious if you have experiences you can share or just thoughts on the topic of if regulation is a driver for inclusion and accessibility, if it's a hindrance, and also what we can do to steer it in the right direction and get it moving in the right direction.
I can actually talk a lot about the accessibility aspect, because a lot of the standards and the assessments are actually driven by regulation. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that have been there around since the 1980s, incorporated by the World Wide Web, and the Web Accessibility Initiative, which has industry experts. It's a very multi-stakeholder approach. It started with version 1.0, and now we're at version 2.2. It is baked into regulations in the US with the American Disability Act, and the Canadian regulation as well, but that's only for public sector. And it was also a part of the EU regulations that is mandated with, again, public sector, but the EU Disability Act that's coming into force next year in June 2025 will mandate private sector to also be able to comply. So being accessible helps a lot with social inclusion. It helps a lot with positioning from an optimization point of view. But it also saves the companies a lot of issues with compliance and fines. And there have been a lot of hefty fines, which is why the ADA is so robust, whether it's Netflix or Harvard Universities, for something as simple as closed captions, or Target, which is an amazing e-commerce company that kind of works with different federations, with the blind and the deaf, to ensure that accessibility is baked into different digital interfaces that they have, public-facing or otherwise. But for the security aspect, maybe Liz, you could talk a little bit about a use case of how you'll do security audits differently, what's helped in the past, given the experience that you have. Maybe you could shed light on that. And I hope that answers your question. Okay.
In terms of the security audits, yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting experience of doing the audits. I know that security audits are not anything new, but there is a more of a movement as more open source software is out there, that there's also more open reports about the security of systems. And I think that we will need to get to the point to also making that information more accessible to people, especially if we are concerned about, the social engineering attacks and stuff like that. I think we've got a ways to go to make that information more understanding. Security is very complex for people at the moment, but as we embrace new security models in the new systems, like the way that we're architecting new financial service technology is allowing us to have different security approaches, different security models in these systems, which then changes the impact to the end user down the road too, as to how they're interacting with the systems. And so this will all get looped together, I think, over time with more of the security audits and the publishing of that information.
And how do you think is it relevant to the Interledger Protocol here?
Well, I mean, it's incredibly relevant to publish security information if you're working with open source software. So that's an easy one. But again, coming to the bigger picture of inclusivity with financial services, again, information is power. So the more that we are open about how we are checking the systems, not just building, but also checking the systems, is going to be incredibly important to, again, just make them inclusive and accessible to more people.
And how do we do that with the users? What would you recommend?
Do you mean like to how to get them to understand the security better?
Yeah.
I think it's everywhere, everything from that, like that ground level, doing the usability testing, the accessibility testing, having that interaction with the users about what they want. We can also have security usability testing too. I mean, that has to be baked in, that when you're checking with people about like how they're understanding buttons on an interface or how they're interacting with voice systems, you should also be asking the question of, can this be faked? Can this be phished and stuff like that? And we can look at that at the user interviews and stuff like that, those kind of user, like those conversations that we have with them. And so we can just do it at all different levels. We can also do that on the information publishing side too.
You have thoughts on that?
I'm actually going to go back to the regulator. Is that okay?
Of course.
Sorry. So I think, I don't know what it's like currently with regulators across, but speaking from my experience in Australia, I joined government for 5 years because there was a lack of technologists, designers, and people that work at the intersection of design, technology, and social justice and psychology to join the regulator and get, but no one else wanted to join from my sort of university and from my peer group, because you get, number one, it's very exhausting because you're explaining at a very basic level, according to you, things to people who come from a different angle, right? So for example, I own a couple of companies and we get paid for taking risk. It's very difficult to then go into the regulator space and be like, risk is the worst thing ever, and we need to shut this down. So I think the interoperability and the flow of talent between private, open source, and government, and whether the regulators are government entities or not, like, I think there needs to be a flow of talent, and there needs to be not two sides to the table, but just a round rotating sort of experience, I feel, for these conversations to move faster. Because often it's I do this, I write this document, I give it to them, then they get some panel of like, it's just so slow, and tech is moving so fast. So I'm really keen to have like that churn of talent around, and how can we facilitate that? Like, for example, a lot of financial services companies pay for their employees to go get an MBA. And in our company, we've started to give people some amount of monetary buffer to go join government for a few years and then come back, so that there is that level of talent going in that's still plugged in, because even if you're super talented and you go in when you're 25, after 15 years, maybe, you know, your skills from the tech world aren't as updated in your knowledge. So yeah, we do facilitate that.
You know, I think with regulations and the open and accessible standards, I agree a lot with the talent aspect and upskilling. I think there's a lot of education that's needed there, though my reservations on the MBA are different. But I would also say that I think it's really important to have users diverse users and multiple users being tested at different points, many a times you can get a lot of false positives. You might be 100% compliant with a particular security audit or a web content accessibility audit and still have challenges because something is incompatible or it doesn't work for a particular user. I know that we're running out of time, so maybe we have time for questions or suggestions. I think we can open up for questions if there are any, and if not, we can sum it up.
I think the question of who's funding open source and the exchange with that with closed sources, you have to think about the financial incentives for everything. I would argue that we see open source actually driving the innovation in a completely different way than just a profit incentive. Google doesn't open source its search engine, but it does open source all of its infrastructure code, and that's because it's a completely commoditized part of its business, so it can do that. The other thing that we've seen in the EU, at least, is a movement for public money, public code. So if a government is going to be buying software and funding software development, that money should not be going into a for-profit company. It should actually be into open source software that other governments can also use. And then we've also seen granting specifically for like open source software that hasn't gone through accessibility audits or security audits. And so the EU has actually put a ton of money specifically into public grants just to help existing open source software get better at that. I'm wondering, do you have any other examples of that in other countries?
Yeah, from my experience, from what I've seen, it's been mostly the US and the EU that's been investing in open source software development, but it would be great to see more of that happening, of course. And I do think it's been great to see that not only are they investing in open source development of tools that can be for public goods, they're also looking at other aspects of like security and safety and stuff like that for people who are in unprivileged, disadvantaged situations in general, wanting to speak out, like journalists and stuff like that, and human rights activists. And so that all movement is great. I would love to see that even carry more into the financial services space too. And I think we see a little bit of that kind of coming with like some of the cryptocurrency, blockchain, Web3 space, that we're seeing some additional funding coming towards that, but and it is generally open source that they're supporting. But yeah, I think the tech industry and other places around the world have more work to do too.
We have less than 2 minutes now, so if there's anyone else who has any questions, if not, maybe we could get summaries from both of you and wrap it up, because I know it is the lunch hour and we don't want to keep all of you waiting. Any final thoughts, conclusions?
I'm just surprised that people are here past lunch, so thank you. What a privilege to have all of you still here at the end of the talk. Last remarks, I think for me, is people first finance and thinking of, like we keep thinking of shoving banks into phones, and how can digital devices become part of the financial system. Those are the two things that I've been thinking throughout all the wonderful sessions that have been going on over the like it seems like more than a day, but yesterday and today. So yeah, I'd love to, connect with you guys on those two things and continuously have conversations about goodies and baddies.
A final thing I want to say is that we are on the brink of a very significant financial revolution that has to do with like digital finance. We've already started it. It's changing how we're doing things. And some of you were probably around for the internet early days and how much that fundamentally changed like retail and communication around the world. And we're about to do that. We're doing that again with the financial industry, and it's so exciting, but we have a really small window of time, and there's a lot of pressure on us. I mean, sorry, it's the truth, to be able to make sure that we architect this in a way that we can protect more human rights and that we can do more financial inclusion of these services, like giving financial services access to people, to more people. We just have this small window of time, and I just have a call to action to like take it seriously. Let's all continue to work hard together to make sure that we make it accessible and inclusive as much as possible, because we can do it better this time.
Amazing. And time's up. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're all available at lunch and throughout the summit. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and have a great day. Thanks.